HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Race to the Future, 8,000 Miles to Paris, The Adventure That Accelerated the 20th Century, by Kassia St. Read by Kassia St.
We invent the future out of fragments from the past. Erwin Panofsky, 1892 to 1968. Preface. He would be a rash man who would deny that within a dozen years or so, the entire balance of the world's population may not be shifted by means of the all-conquering motor. Commons Beaumont, 1907. In January 1907, Le Matin, a Parisian newspaper, threw down a gauntlet to the world. What they proposed was an automobile race across 2 continents, a grand experiment that would push the boundaries of a fledgling technology. The trailblazing motorists would set off from Peking and drive westwards to Paris, passing through 5 capital cities and covering some 8,000 miles. What would unfold over the following months was both a rip-roaring adventure and a parable about the birth of a new world. Ours. While such a journey might be daunting even today, in 1907 the idea of driving so far and through such remote country was considered laughable. But just as Le Matin had intended, it drew the eyes of the world. A week after the race was proposed, the Sydney Morning Herald called it such a bold and gigantic scheme that it almost takes one's breath away, and sufficient to frighten the pluckiest and most enterprising of promoters. For the Evening Bulletin of Honolulu, it was the most stupendous automobile race ever undertaken. According to one estimate, between 500,000 and 600,000 people thronged to the rain-soaked streets of Paris to see the winner enter the city. Participants, several of whom nearly died in the attempt, were compared to heroic age explorers like Richard Francis Burton, Roald Amundsen, and Ernest Shackleton. The winner was a pioneer of civilization whose name will be quoted by future generations. The Peking-Paris was a decisive moment. It put the utility and practical significance of the automobile beyond doubt. Afterwards, even the most hardened skeptics could not ignore its potential as a rival to the railway, or its applications in both civilian and military life. If the race was not quite the reason the automobile triumphed, it certainly smoothed its path. In practical terms, driving across 2 continents was the sternest test the technology had faced. Although there had been races and rallies before, they had been far shorter. One contemporary called it the greatest event in the automotive world, not just for the past year, but even for the entire existence of self-moving carriages. The endeavour was adjudged to have worldwide economic and social significance. The Sunday Times dared prophesy, after the completion of the Peking-Paris, that the automobile may be looked upon as one of the greatest mediums of civilization in the future, as it will penetrate into the furthest corners of the earth long before such places are reached by regular trade routes. The race also had potent symbolic resonance as a harbinger of a new era of globalization. The distance between East and West had never before seemed so small and traversable. The Peking-to-Paris Motor race may have something to do with the poetry of motion, argued a writer in the South China Morning Post, but it helps to destroy the poetry of distance. Locomotion and communication are making the world smaller. Portions of the Silk Roads, which had begun to wither with the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway, could suddenly be reimagined, as they are being once again today, thanks to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Automobiles could be agents for progress, civilization, and peace. One journalist opined that similar rallies, universal attempts to extend the civilization of the world, would be their own form of diplomacy. Wars are likely to disappear, since the common interests will become so strong in the future that they will easily absorb the separate interests of different nations. The Peking-to-Paris encapsulates the West's ideas about herself and her role in the world a few short years before these would be overturned by the First World War and the breakdown of empires. It is emblematic of the struggles of the Old World to retain technological and industrial supremacy, and it offers a window into Russia and China at pivotal moments in their history, moments that seem increasingly relevant to their own self-image and foreign policy today. It is difficult to comprehend the scale of the challenge the Peking-Paris competitors faced. For a start, automobiles were in their infancy. Carl Benz motor wagon, usually celebrated as the very first automobile, was patented in 1886. It was a spindly contraption consisting of an engine, a seat, and 3 wheels. It fielded around 0.6 horsepower, HP, like an underpowered hotel hairdryer on wheels, and managed a top speed of just under 10 miles per hour. By 1907, the technology had progressed, but automobiles were still rare and considered unreliable. An article in The Economist castigated those who had rushed with such luckless enthusiasm to invest in motor bus companies, arguing instead that the horse is coming triumphantly through the ordeal. Although there had been races and rallies before Le Matin proposed the Peking-Paris, they had been far shorter and notoriously dangerous, usually involving fatalities. Automobiles were temperamental, prone to frequent breakdowns and punctures. Most owners considered it essential to employ a chauffeur who could both drive and maintain the machine in working order. Motoring manuals contained long lists of the tools, lubricants, spare tyres and parts that it was advisable to carry, even on short journeys. This was a particular worry for the Peking-Paris racers, who would be physically unable to take the necessities for so long a journey with them, and, for the first 5,000 miles or so, would be unable to procure them. They were also so expensive to buy, run and repair that they were out of reach of all but wealthy elites or manufacturers. The year of the race, 1907, was one of the last when the automobile would be considered an experimental novelty rather than a practical form of transport. Radical sporting events like the Peking-Paris, which emphasised the exploratory and long-distance capabilities of the vehicle rather than the more humdrum ones, would also help nudge car makers to go all in on combustion engines. It was also the final year when Europe, and France in particular, could claim to be the centre of the automobile industry. While their own manufacturers had been rapidly catching up, many Americans were still importing European cars. By October 1908, however, the very first Model T was completed at Henry Ford's plant in Detroit. Already the automobile was settling into a new spiritual home. What made the Peking-Paris so compelling was that the motor car was only half the challenge. Even the most bullish enthusiasts were intimidated by the route. Throughout Western Europe, roads were generally poor outside major cities, and within them many were cobbled or covered with tram rails, which hardly made for an enjoyable ride. Elsewhere, roads often existed in name only. From Peking to Moscow, the initial 4/5 of the route, the motorists would drive on tracks formed by the passage of donkeys, horses, carts, and people on foot. These would be ankle-deep in dust or knee-deep in mud, depending on the weather, and littered with trees, roots, boulders, and other debris. Where there were major obstacles, for example in the mountainous passes north of Peking, vehicles would need to be lifted bodily over obstructions. Where even this proved impossible, drivers would be forced to make their own road, using pickaxes, axes, and shovels. Most of the land through which the motorists would drive was remote and sparsely populated. Accidents or miscalculations about equipment, food, or fuel supplies could prove fatal. Participants would have to scale mountain ranges and cross a desert. The vehicles in the race were phaeton style, the most common at the time, which meant that apart from flimsy canvas canopies, soon discarded to keep the weight down, they would be open to the elements. Since there were no fuel stations, fuel would need to be sent out in advance and left in strategic locations. For a portion of the route, this meant transporting fuel by camel. If motorists failed to locate a cache, or if one was pilfered before they reached it, they would be stranded. Despite the doom-mongering, participating in so historic an event proved a strong lure. The starting line would feature a compelling and varied cast of characters. Among their number were an Italian prince and his chauffeur, a former French professional racing driver, and a con man, as well as journalists whose job it was to write and transmit regular reports on their progress. The Peking-Paris was a news age phenomenon, garnering headlines from Melbourne to New York, Manchester to Shanghai. Newspapers revelled in the glamour and drama of the race, spinning it as a triumph of modernity over antiquation, of speed over sloth, of Western civilization over Eastern barbarism. There was also a sense that it was a triumph of journalism. Proposed by a canny French newspaper, the story held the news-reading world captive for months, elevating the newspapers and journalists involved as surely as it did the automobile itself. And it was the telegraph that would prove crucial to the whole endeavour. Its physical structures, offices, wires and poles, helped shape the route, while also transmitting updates to readers around the globe. Although focused on the immediate difficulties and dangers of the race, the Peking-Paris motorists were witnesses to seismic historical events. China, although vast and the source of many luxury goods coveted by other nations, was largely viewed with contempt by the West. During the previous half-century, she had endured a number of humiliating and expensive military defeats, leaving her with enormous debts and a tattered reputation. Relations with many Western powers were strained. A vivid image by French political cartoonist Henri Meyer in 1898 neatly sums up the state of China's foreign relations. In it, Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and a Japanese samurai are seated around an enormous pie labelled China. While they wield knives and squabble over who will take the best slices, a Manchu gentleman stands behind them with his hands raised in impotent horror. To make matters worse, the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for over 260 years, was faltering from one crisis to the next. It would fall 4 years after the Peking-Paris, ending more than 2 millennia of imperial rule, ushering in a period of turmoil and paving the way for the rise of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China. The Russian Empire too was in tumult. In the late 1800s, it was the largest empire in the world, stretching from the Black Sea in the west to the Bering Straits in the east, with a population of around 135 million. Its sheer size, not to mention its geographic, cultural and linguistic diversity, made it challenging to govern. Like China, it had been ruled by the same dynasty since the 17th century, and the system they were using to control their territory was beginning to show signs of strain. The empire was reeling after the revolution of 1905 and a bruising defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Although in theory the unrest had been quelled and concessions made, including the formation of an elected parliament, the situation was anything but peaceful. Arson, murder and armed robbery were daily occurrences. Soldiers were stationed at every bridge and patrolled city streets. Aristocratic estates were regularly overrun, pillaged and burned by the peasantry. A few days before the first motorists crossed the border, Tsar Nicholas II and Prime Minister Stolypin seized back political power from the Duma in what is often called the June coup. Things were scarcely less troubled in the West. In terms of size and scope, this time is often seen as the high watermark for colonial expansion. From the late 19th century, both older colonial powers, including France, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, and newcomers, Japan, Italy and the United States, had scrambled to acquire influence and territory in Asia and Africa. Technological developments such as the telegraph and railways had allowed them to acquire and exert greater control over conquered land and people. However, holding on to these empires was beginning to create more and more problems. Colonial expansion and retention was costly, both financially and in terms of lives lost to uprisings and disease. Squabbles between colonial powers were also escalating as they tried to secure raw materials, trade routes, and fertile land in which to grow cotton, tea, indigo, and other valuable crops. The dawn of the new century would see imperial rulers engaged in tense diplomatic wrangling, crystallizing the alliances and enmities that would play a pivotal role in the outbreak of the First World War 7 years later. My fascination with the Peking-Paris story began with a mistake. Researching the origins of Rosso Corsa, Italy's racing red, for The Secret Lives of Colour, I came across numerous references to Prince Borghese and his pioneering run from Peking to Paris. The story went that Italy selected the colour of the prince's car as its national racing colour in tribute to his success. Captivated, I wrote the story in my book, dutifully emailing the museum that houses the car today to confirm that the Itala, now a dull grey, had once been bright red. Legend had it that the car had been hastily repainted to prevent rusting after being accidentally dropped off a boat. To my horror, it would turn out to be untrue. The museum tested the paint all the way down to the metal, and not a scrap of scarlet was found. Worse, I received this information after The Secret Lives of Colour had gone to press. This was far from the first red herring I would encounter. Those participants who later published books about the Peking-Paris race had a habit of obfuscating the truth, prompted by rivalry, loyalty, censorship, the desire for a good story, or patriotic fervour. One simply turned out to be an inveterate liar. A resurgence of interest in early automobiles and races during the 1950s and 1960s, particularly in Britain, produced several more books about the race. While dashing reads, these helped enfold the Peking-Paris in further layers of myth. Researching this book has been an exercise in pruning back legends and unearthing previously overlooked primary sources. By going back to and cross-checking against contemporaneous telegrams and news reports, I hope to put a few hardy Peking-Paris fables to rest, including the one about Rosso Corsa that I unwittingly helped fuel. The desire to dig deeper into the race and explore its historical context took me to a host of unlikely locations. A family home on an island in Lake Garda, archives at Hong Kong University and Queen's University Belfast, automotive museums in Turin and at Brooklands, and an otherwise unremarkable hill in Camborne, Cornwall. I spoke to family members of the original racers who generously shared photographs, documents, and troves of family lore. I interviewed enthusiasts who have organised or participated in recent Peking-Paris rallies. Many Peking-Paris enthusiasts will wonder why this book uses the term race rather than rally, which is preferred today. My reason is simple. It was predominantly referred to and experienced as a race by contemporaries, including participants. Some of the research and most of the writing of this book took place during the COVID-19 pandemic and the early months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This made my plans to retrace the original route with my husband in a vintage Toyota Land Cruiser impossible. It is my sincerest hope that we will one day fulfill this dream, although by that time we'll be taking our daughter with us. She was born a week after the 116th anniversary of the start of the race. Doing justice to the Peking-Paris story has meant learning about the development of the automobile, which led, in turn, to finding out more about horse-powered transport, road accidents, telegraphy, and the politics of oil. So that I could get a better understanding of the people and places the Peking-Paris participants encountered, I unearthed accounts by others who had travelled the same way in the years before and after 1907. Within the book, these themes and others interleave the primary narrative of the race in the form of standalone essays. What writing this book has taught me, and what I will share with you, is that the Peking-Paris race is a parable about a world teetering on the very edge of the most consequential century in human history. We are the inheritors of the world the Peking-Paris race helped create. March 2023, Vauxhall, London. Men travel faster now, but I do not know if they go to better things. Willa Cather, 1927. Prologue. Peking, 10th of June. It is 3 minutes to 9 on the morning of the 10th of June, 1907. Gloved hands elegantly raise a white flag high into the air, and the crowd below hushes. Or hushes as much as a crowd of that size ever could. Within the parade ground of the French legation in Peking, the panting of several stray dogs and the yips of a pet can still be heard, along with a chuckling coloratura of caged larks held by a few Chinese dignitaries. Horses' harnesses, spurs, and dress swords clink. Ladies' skirts rustle. The click of cameras. A breeze jostles colourful bunting and a large banner over the gate reading Bon Voyage. The wind brings with it the quickening patter of a June rainstorm that might, with luck, fall long enough to slake Peking's dust, but cease before it renders the streets an oozing, mustard-hued morass. Discernible above, below, and overwhelming all other sounds is one never heard on the city streets before: the throbbing, thrillingly modern basso profundo of 5 automobile engines. The automobiles had gathered in the misty parade ground just before 7:30, expecting an 8 o'clock departure, but at 10 minutes past the hour they remained stationary. Tedious formalities gobble up the minutes. The crowd, buzzing like an overheated hive, is polyglot and overwhelmingly European. The band of the French colonial infantry hustle through their repertoire. Diplomats and businessmen from France, Holland, America, Russia, and Britain talk shop in a confusion of tongues. Some had arrived by train earlier that morning or the day before from the business centres of Tientsin and Shanghai to witness the historic start of China's first automobile race. Most drolly predict it will end before the cars reach the Great Wall, a day or so's ride north. They regale one another with a crescendo of travellers' tales, the rocky pinch of mountain passes, infested roadside inns, ruts like moats, the parched vastness of the Gobi. Heads turned to watch the slow progress through the crowd of a dignified, white-bearded figure. Sir Robert Hart, Inspector General of China's Customs Service and the most revered foreigner in China, nods and exchanges greetings with acquaintances, leaving a respectful hush in his wake. He stops to talk to a statuesque couple wearing well-tailored, ankle-length travelling coats. It is Prince Borghese, driver of the Atala, and his wife, Anna Maria. She is vivacious, putting both hands out in greeting and smiling. Borghese inclines his head. Nearby, Jean Dutaillis, a correspondent for Le Matin, due to travel with the Spiker, perches on a packing case like an ungainly heron. An assortment of clothes, long limbs, and wire-framed spectacles, he is completely absorbed in scribbling a last-minute dispatch. Luigi Barzini, his slight, beaky colleague from the Italian newspaper Le Corriere della Sera, and a passenger in the Atala, stands a few feet away, one ankle crossed over the other, surveying the scene around him. Of the 5 automobiles in the parade ground, all heaped with luggage and supplies, 2 attract the lion's share of comment. The first is the tiny, 3-wheeled Contal motor tri. Despite being thought of as an automobile, it is clearly more akin to a motorcycle, with 2 wheels at the front, 1 at the rear, and 2 seats, one in front of the other. From the moment its participation was announced months before, experts and casual observers had agreed that its lightness will be an asset on poor roads. Besides, it is French and therefore hails from the heart of the motoring world. Even so, it now seems implausibly frail and overburdened behind its burlier fellows, scarcely robust enough to leave the city, let alone travel 8,000 miles westwards. The Dutch Spiker draws a larger group. Whether this is because of its outlandish paint scheme, the blue, white and red stripes of the French flag, the imposing height of its green canvas cover, its smart Louis Vuitton travel trunks, or the volubility of its barrel-chested, bandy-legged French driver, Charles Goddard, is uncertain. A small contingent from the Dutch legation stand beside it, determinedly ignoring the snub implied by its paintwork and loudly talking up the Netherlands' motoring industry to anyone who will listen. Beside them are the favourites. A twin pair of vehicles from the French manufacturer de Dion-Bouton. Their pedigree is impeccable. Not only are they from the largest and most successful marque, but also their predecessors triumphed in the world's first motor race from Paris to Rouen on 22nd of July 1894. Nearby is the stripped-down carcass of the prince's enormous vehicle, the Italian Itala. Its bodywork has been removed, and so have the seats and practically everything else. In place of mudguards are long wooden planks, on which are stowed a few lengths of rope, a pickaxe and blankets. It is easily 5 times the size of the smallest competitor, the Cantal, and roars loudest, its engine packing nearly 3 times the horsepower of the next most powerful vehicle, the Spiker. Notwithstanding the hauteur of its driver, it seems a hulking skeletal cart horse next to its sleeker, leaner rivals. Something Goddard says, one hand tented on his chest, the other raised in declamation, elicits laughs and cheers of bravo. A soldier wandering over to Dutaïs smirks and waves a cigarette in Goddard's direction, wondering how the journalist will fit into the Spiker, overflowing as it will be with the ego of his travelling companion. Eyeing Goddard, Dutaïs shrugs. That's just the braggart of the Gobi. If he is privately less sanguine, he consoles himself with the thought that Goddard will at least make for compelling copy. Speaking of which, might the soldier be able to take this report to the telegraph office for him? Today, if possible. He wants to make Le Matin's front page. Dutaïs gets up to stretch his legs and say his goodbyes. Catching his eye, Barzini smiles, shakes his head, and turns towards the imposing figure of the Italian prince, in whose vehicle he will travel. Finally, the preliminaries are complete. Each driver has been solemnly handed a note for 2,000 francs by a representative of the Russo-Chinese Bank, the return of a deposit they paid months before to secure their place in the most daring automotive challenge the world has ever known. The time is 8:50 a.m. Passengers extricate themselves from conversations and stride to their vehicles, fighting to squeeze in amidst luggage and equipment. Cavalry officers mount their horses. They will escort the cars out of the fortified legation quarter and into the city beyond. The band form up by the gate. 8:54 a.m. Drivers move to the front of their vehicles, insert crank handles and give them a sharp, clockwise turn. Engines snort into life. Plumes of smoke erupt from 5 exhausts and fill the air with the acrid smell of combusting fuel. 8:56 a.m. The starter is Madame Boisson, wife of the first secretary of the French legation. She takes up a position in full view, holding her white flag in one hand and a bottle of champagne in the other, and looks round at a carpet of expectant faces. The scene settles. Voices mute. Faces crane towards her. Hands tighten on wheels. Down flies the flag. Smash goes the bottle. Shards of emerald glass and champagne spume catch the light. The race from Peking to Paris has begun. Chapter 1. Hitting the Road. Birth of the automobile. Of all inventions, the alphabet and the printing press alone excepted, those inventions which abridge distance have done most for the civilization of our species. Every improvement of the means of locomotion benefits mankind morally and intellectually as well as materially. Thomas Babington Macaulay, The History of England, 1848. By the time everything was ready, it was dusk, Christmas Eve, 1801. A burly group of men emerged from John Tyek's smithy at a crossroads in Cambourne, Cornwall. Into the glowing red square of light cast by the forges, they dragged an enormous, puffing engine mounted on a wooden chassis with thick, creaking carriage wheels. The air smelt of wood smoke, hay, and hot metal. Captain Richard Dick Trevithick, engineer at the Ding Dong mine near Penzance, and proud inventor of the contraption about to be unleashed on its maiden voyage, supervised proceedings. A stoker shovelled wood and coal into the machine's fiery drum. Trevithick examined the gauges. Satisfied, he mounted and pulled his cousin, Andrew Vivian, up beside him. 7 or 8 men scrambled aboard too. Vivian pulled a lever and the machine moved steadily off, its pistons pumping the crosshead up and down like a guillotine. Whooping with delight, the party chugged along the steep, curving lane up Cambourne Hill towards Beacon, puffs of steam emerging from the stack into the frigid air. This journey, Neither particularly long nor picturesque, and accomplished at the same pace as a trotting horse, was nevertheless the very first undertaken in a passenger vehicle powered by an engine.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?